Now, you're very welcome back. Thanks very much. Our next speaker is Jim Herlihy, and the title of his talk is The Black and Tans in Context. Jim is a retired member of An Garda Síochána and co-founder of the Garda Historical Society. He has written 3 books on the Royal Irish Constabulary, 2 books on the Dublin Metropolitan Police, and 1 on the Irish Revenue Police. Please welcome Jim.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted. Thanks for the opportunity to speak, and unusually to speak about the Black and Tans, because, as you see, what has happened in the last couple of months between governments coming and going and things like that, that's the effect the Black and Tans can have even to this day. But outside of all that, my main interest at this stage is in the casualties, police casualties, and I'll focus on that at the start and just refer to Peter Burke in where he figures in all of that great big picture. And you'll be surprised the scale of it. And in addition to, when I say police casualties from 1836 up to 1922, there were also casualties in the First World War. Believe it or not, 752 RIC men were accepted for service in World War I. 176 were killed. No memorial, and no memorial otherwise to those killed on duty, which is absolutely extraordinary. There were 85,028 passed through the system, including 1,700 officers. As regards the casualties, just on a brief history of policing in Ireland, this just refers to the country of Ireland, with the exception of Dublin, which had its own police force from 1836. And that continued until 1925, when it was amalgamated with the Dublin Metropolitan Police. It became the Dublin Metropolitan Division, or the DMD, of the Garda Síochána. From 1822 up to 1836, it got the prefix Royal from 1867 for suppressing the Fenian Rising. It was disbanded fully on the 31st of August 1922. The Garda Síochána was formed in February of 1922, and the Royal Ulster Constabulary was formed on the 1st of June 1922. If a memorial was to exist, it would look something like this. This is just only the First World War casualties, 176. I've located every single one of their graves, matched everything with the War Graves Commission. A third of those that were killed were sons of RIC men. Now, as regards those killed during the War of Independence, not generally talked about, but the condition and circumstance in which they were killed is absolutely phenomenal in all different situations. There were those on patrol, 89, ambushed, including Kilmichael, 17, Drumkeen, Rathmore, the main ambushes. Those on cycled patrols, 111 shot, and 7 of those were cycling to court. They were on foot, walking to and from barracks, attending church, seeking assistance of a priest, seeking assistance of a shooting incident, and locations to which they were killed were at barracks, bomb and gun attacks, 6, and some were assassinated in shops, pubs, hotels, restaurants, trains and trams, attending a fire, going to a dance, at a race meeting, out driving with friends, fishing and even swimming. Some of those were killed on escort duty, 32 were killed at home. Some of them were killed in traffic accidents, 33 involved in traffic accidents, because they were mobile all the time. 25 were abducted, 4 of which have never been found, and others were killed in riots. 1 was drowned. Now, a memorial to those would extend to something like that, 642 lives. As regards the rank structure of those that were killed, you see 6 of the 642. The system completely changes on the 1st of January of 1920 with what we now know to be the Black and Tans, and they had a different kind of a rank structure, which I'll explain later. From 1916 up to 1922, you can see how rough it was for them. In 1919, there were only 15 casualties, 195 in 1920, and in September, when Peter Burke was killed, it was 26. And then you can see the worst scenario, just less than 7 months in 1921, 275 policemen were killed. And that's just running up to the truth. And you can see 40 were actually killed, some in retirement. A father and 2 sons taken out and shot, retired from the RIC. And as regards where the came from, of that total, 439 were Irish, killed by Irishmen. And these are the English ones that were killed, 145, the majority being in London. Then Scotland 23, and others, when I say Australia, Canada, India and places like that. Not to read any Indians in the place at the time, but they would have been sons of RIC officers, or British Army officers who were from there. The members that were killed on 112 in Cork is the biggest one, and you can see Dublin there is 43. As regards religions being killed, didn't matter about your religion, the majority were Catholic, 368, with 228 Protestant. And this is where Peter Burke comes into the picture. He was the 97th casualty of the War of Independence, and of 195 that were killed that year. He was the 9th of 26 casualties killed in the month of September 1920, and a further 275 lost their lives up to the truce, and 40 later on. And this is Peter Burke himself, the photograph seen it earlier on, killed in Balbriggan, and his brother was wounded. This is his service record. It's an updated version that I got since the last one that I got, but I definitely have I know at this stage there was actually 3 brothers I make out. Michael, we have the same fathers and same mother's maiden name. Now, they were actually born, you'll see down here in a place on the next part of it here, Clonfane, Tuam, County Galway. It actually, the 3 of them were born at, but Boyuna is the place where the family had moved to, and in fact you'll find them in the census, all that family in the census, and the headstone that was put up was actually put up by the sister, and there she's actually in the census also. Now, just going back there on the service record, he was 5'10" and the 7/8, and you can see it's the correct date of birth. From Galway East Riding, recommended by District Inspector Patrick Mahan. In fact, I got a photograph of him recently in contact with his granddaughter. The places where he was stationed in County Antrim, the service record only tells you the county, but the records that are up in 5 mile past at this stage, there were nominal rolls in some of the years, and you can actually now identify a person in a particular station. I think it began 1910, 1911, there's some gaps, but 1920 and 21, you can identify the places. And he was in a place called Harryville and Kells in County Antrim. He was down in Kerry, Lara, Crumpon and the Stole. Then he was in Kilrush Reserve Force. It's interesting that he was there. He was involved in the organisation of where policemen were to be replaced in areas, and that's why he was, it looks like that he was picked to come to Gormanston. He was on the promotion list. He was notified of his promotion. The reason he's a head constable when he was killed is the rules go as regards officers in the RIC in that a cadet officer, when he's not actually an officer until such time as he takes up his post and he's then appointed a third class district inspector. The same, the non-commissioned ranks, the highest rank of non-commissioned is head constable. And so the unfortunate part for him, and probably relates more or less to compensation afterwards, that he's not effectively a district inspector. If he had gone straight to Gormanston and signed the book, he'd have a transfer order with him, and he effectively would be a district inspector, and that's where the confusion arises with that, and that explains it. I've seen it in several cases. He was promoted head constable. His promotion was fairly rapid anyway. He got the Constabulary medal, and that's a photograph of the type of medal that he would have got. I think there's about 350 given out in the War of Independence, mostly for defensive stations. His was for Moyona Hut in County Clare. And now that's his brother. I've only got that. When I didn't realise, only searching the other day, I came across this. And this, when he was on the promotion list, his brother William. And he volunteered for service in World War I. He volunteered for service in World War I. And you could see there the date he's admitted to the RIC is in 1902, but he's readmitted after his service in 1919, and it takes into effect, there was actually an Act of Parliament passed to guarantee them pension rights for those who volunteered for World War I service that did have continual service. So he's getting collective service of 16 years, 1 month and 2 days for his time in the RIC and the Army. And then he goes back into the reserve. Again, he goes into reserve at that stage. And then he gets promoted in 1915, even though he's away. He'd already passed a promotion examination before he left. And then he goes on to County Westmeath. You see there he's selected for service in the Irish Guards, and that was his number private, 10169. The majority of the RIC men who volunteered for World War service went to the Irish Guards. There was a distinction between them, is that the RIC, it was more difficult to get into the RIC than it was to the Irish Guards. And the RIC man, P.J. Larkin, that I was lucky enough to interview, the time I interviewed him in 1996, he was 74 years a pensioner, so he got enough money off the Crown at the time. He was he's a guy with a great sense of humour, but he told me that it would be 19 years to join, but if your father was in it, you got a year off the age. You'd be 5'9", but if your father was in it, you would be 5'8". And the reason he was telling me all this, he says, I squeezed in on the both counts. He went on to England afterwards, on to London. I don't know whether he came back to Ireland or not, but on his pension record it shows that he's in Kentish Town. Now, the structure with the RIC up to the 31st of December 1919 was that most of the recruits, with the exception of a few, and especially only in relation to officers, were born in England and recruited. They were all recruited in Ireland. There's a few with the RIC band specialists and that type of thing. But that all changed on the 31st of July 1919. And in fact, recruiting had been going on in December, because you can see the dates on some of the towns as we now know them is the 17th of December and up to 21st December. They were recruited not alone in London, but I've tracked them across 85 different training centres or training depots all over the United Kingdom, Ireland, Wales and Scotland. And eventually, when they come to Ireland, they either go straight into apply through the depot, through Gormanston Camp after September of 1920, and they join from there. Now, they're broken up into different groups. There's the RIC Special Reserve. Now, the regular fellow who joined the RIC up to that time went down to his local sergeant. He was recommended by a district inspector. He did a medical examination, he was sent up to the depot, and then he joined at that stage. What happened with the RIC Special Reserve is that they joined in all these centres in London, London being the main one. And the man was, there was a county inspector sent over and a district inspector, and they did recruiting, and the main recruiting in London was in Great Scotland Yard. And the RIC Special Reserve, 7,674 up to the end, joined that. 380 of those were Irish. 53 were from Dublin. They were recruited from Britain from January 1920, and they were generally called the Black and Tans. Now, they get this term, the Black and Tans, because in March of 1920, in Limerick, there was men getting in uniform, getting off the train, going to the various stations. And they had an RIC cap, they had an RIC belt, they had a whistle, but they had either a black and tan uniform, black or tan, and vice versa. It was all mixed up. But what was clearly seen about them was the harp and the crown on the cap, and they're identified as policemen with the whistle. And the reporter in Limerick who reported that at the time, the name takes off and it outlives them later on. But the RIC Special Reserve, as distinct from temporary constables, there is not one temporary constable in the RIC until September of 1920. No matter where you read it, but the records speak for themselves. And they actually speak for it in red. They're actually written in red. And the auxiliary division are called temporary cadets. So you have those joined. No, their function at that time was to replace the RIC who had either resigned, were dismissed, who left the service, were killed on duty, and there was a huge onslaught and an attack on the RIC at the time, and it was getting worse and worse. Initially they came to Dublin, and in May of 1920 their training began down in Hare Camp in the Curragh. there was such a shortage of uniforms that there were still, believe it or not, very short numbers of regular RIC men joining, and I see most of those have RIC connections already, more as a career job for them. They were doing the 6 months training. These others, RIC Special Reserve, were doing very short training. They were only needed really to replace the others as a backup. I've never seen any of their paperwork as such, of them doing reports. They weren't trained to do police work. They had such a short time. So they literally went out as a security with the regular RIC. And it was impossible then in a situation where a major event occurred. The military could arrive at it, the RIC Special Reserve, the regular RIC, and what confused it more when the auxiliaries come on board afterwards. They could all go to the same, that's why this is easily called the whole lot black and tans at that stage. Then you had, what the sequence of events then is that they're trained, and their training continues the whole way through, but in September it moves to Gormanston. Now what happens in between is there's such an onslaught of barracks. If you see the crime reports of the time, it's absolutely phenomenal that the IRA are really getting on top of things and the scale of the attacks is absolutely huge. At the same time, Winston Churchill wants to go after the RIC and he wants to strike force. He doesn't get it at the start, but in July of 1920, he accomplishes that and he gets the auxiliary division. Now, the difference between those and the RIC Special Reserve is they're ex-army officers, commissioned officers. Now, they arrive in their officers' uniform was the Sam Browns. They wear different types of uniforms. They're allowed to wear their own uniforms and distinguished cap and have different flashes for various companies that are formed. The companies are formed in alphabetical order, and it's quite easy to trace them at the start because in that order, like A Company, for example, Z Company didn't exist at the start. It's there in the order which it was formed. But of course, what confused the issue afterwards, if they dirtied their bib like K Company in Cork, Burn Cork, and they were moved to another place, you had another unit replacing them, it can go all over. But I'm satisfied that I have at the very start as to who went into what company. They can be traced after that. Now, the idea of the training was also in Hare Camp for the auxiliaries. It was a 6-week course. That started mid-July and it ended in September. And they moved to Beggar's Bush. Now, as they were to be a strike force, they were trained, they needed transport on a huge scale. So that's the reason Gormanston Camp was opened up. They also needed a huge amount of drivers. They also need to service the transport. That's why the motorised division operated out of Gormanston. And when the various companies were formed, what they call drafts of temporary constables went with those. There's one person gave an account, Douglas Valder Duff, it's actually, believe it or not, Roger Casten's godchild. He gives an account actually of his time in the depot and how they moved out, and he ended up in Galway. And in fact, he said in the book about his attempt even to arrest Michael Collins, a bit of a tall order, but he ends up in Palestine afterwards. Just as regards the temporary constables, 49 from Dublin, they were recommended by the Inspector General and temporary constable on their service records. They were comprised of ex-non-commissioned officers in the British Army, headquartered and trained in Gormanston Camp from the 11th of September. Now, this is only a week before Balbriggan. So, for a policeman to be killed a week after they arrived in Gormanston, you couldn't make it up as regards a backlash. Because what was happening is, what was in Gormanston Camp, there were literally no policemen in Gormanston Camp. There was just only some clerks who were involved in actually the setup of it. But it was complete tinderbox. On top of that then you had the auxiliaries moved to Beggar's Bush and they were patrolling around Dublin. You see one of their first cases, they were supposed to act on the intelligence of the RIC, and they did some roundups and some of them went wrong. But you had all this, if something happened, and worse still again, Peter Burke was known in headquarters himself personally to some of the policemen. And I'll show you just an account of one of the tents, what he says about it. He verifies everything about burning down the place. And the number begins, 72754, the temporary constable begins with Christopher Tyndall. You will not get a temporary constable before that number in the RIC. Now, you had the Veterans and Drivers Division. These were seasoned RIC men. They would have been, RIC would be, or sorry, they would be non-commissioned British members of the British Army, and they would have had long service, and they would be over the regulation age of 19 years. And a lot of them were just only did fatigues. Some of them were mechanics, and they all operated out of a Gormanston camp. And then when the companies were formed, and some of them moved, for example, when they went to Cork inside the Union Quay, there was one of those inside to just do servicing the trucks. They begin with 70165 onwards, and there were 856, and 115 were Irish born. Now, the auxiliary division, there were 2,264 of those. Now, this is the postcard. This is one of the original postcards mentioned earlier on, and they're all displayed in that. The man on the left is a regular RIC man, but he has a few medal bars. He could be one of those who went off to the First World War. The second fella is a black and tan. Not so much black and tan, but more tan than black. But as you can see, with uniforms, I know it myself in the Guards, you have to wait about 3 or 4 months for your uniform, because you can put a hat on anybody, you can put a belt, and you can give them a whistle. But to match up to different sizes, it's a tailor's job. And that's the uniform situation was sorted out by the end of December, and this is their Christmas postcard. Next one is an auxiliary. The type of dress that they had changed. They were also wear their officer's uniform, and known as temporary cadets. And the other man is the veterans from the Veterans and Drivers Division. He has all his medals from his campaigns in the British Army, and so they dyed some of the uniforms blue, more or less for fatigue purposes. This is what it'll tell you how young they are. That's them inside in Hare Camp at the time. They are what real tans in the place. Now, the reason I have the dates so accurate with Hare Camp and all that, because if you follow the officers in the RIC, the dates of appointments of those in charge of the various companies and the dates that they take up as training officers is exact, and they're all on the same date. They were so well organised in the RIC depot that if you wanted to look for a fellow from Munster, you went to company number 1, Ulster number 2. They were all built in the various companies according to the province which they came from. Yet when they went out in the square, it didn't matter, they went in their numbers. And what happened then in Gormanston in September, the 5th, 6th and 7th companies were formed in Gormanston, and it was to take the same idea again, but the numbering system would become completely different. But that just shows how young they are at the time. In fact, the fellow on the right there, and his family sent me this one. This is the ad that they would have followed at the time, and as you can see down in London there, at the very end of it, Liverpool, Glasgow. There's some fabulous reports. Once I finished the list of the temporary constables, I went to the newspapers in an absolute field day in singling them out, all the various incidents that they were in. And this idea that they were left out of prison, I've yet to find one left out of prison. Several of them did end up in prison as a result of here. And I just mentioned to someone able to go about one guy by the name of William Moonlight, who was done for bigamy. And his attitude at the time was, the wife ran away, he must have been insane because he said, I had to get another one. So they did bank robberies. One fellow stole a motorcycle at gunpoint in London with a sidecar and drove it all the way up, and he was arrested by a constable from the Dublin Metropolitan Police above Monaghan. Another guy stole a portmanteau, belonged to a rep, I think above in Drogheda, and he was seen hiding it when Gormanston camp, he was sacked. This is the man from Cork who is responsible for bringing in the black and tans. He's a county inspector. He served in the Irish Guards in World War I. His father was Thomas Sylvanus Fleming, district inspector in the RIC, and his grandfather was Thomas Fleming, who was one of the founders of the RIC depot in 1842. This is one, the background report is just like some of the back, this is one for an auxiliary, that the background checks were done. They not alone checked out their address with the police, they also checked out the military regiment that had been attached to their records to see that they had a good record at the time. And there was a proviso in the application form that if you lied about either one, you could be sent home by the Inspector General. They were given a ticket to Dublin. Now, this is the form, it's the identical form for the regular RIC that they would have filled out on the left-hand side. This is, on the other side of the form, descriptive particulars, if they have scars or this type of thing. It shows about them. And that's William Turner, and he's one of the Special Reserve. There's about 20 of those full files. As you know, the full RIC personnel file does not exist except for a sample of 10 that they've held onto in queue. There's a history of those, someone's done a paper on those, how they became to be destroyed. But what has survived is the actual register. It's just to be a register of service. Now, this is the oath that they would have sworn in. They also did a medical where they were, and they did a second medical when they arrived in Dublin. And this is they had to sign this, that if they weren't telling the truth, that they were gone when they arrived in Dublin. And that's an audit. And they had to provide an original birth certificate, and that's a receipt for the birth certificate. They got that back when it was checked out. This is just an example of one guy being checked out by the London Metropolitan Police. He gave a particular address. They got in contact with the London Metropolitan Police. It's all done by telegram. And this is the report back. This will be called to the house. He wasn't there. We spoke to his mother, but he's moved to another address. They called this. They followed up then. There's nothing taken for chance. They followed up to the address, made contact with him, and they also checked out his background, and it gives them a report. At the same time, they check out called to the archives for the military, whatever regiment that he was in, and you see the report back, both stamped, all in a few days, and checked out. And if he had a good record, he was in. Now, this is an account by Constable Alfred Flint, and he's one of those who resigned, and he said he was born in the Isle of Wight on the 25th of August. I checked him against his number, he does exist. And as a former clerk, he was 5'10" in height. He joined the RIC as a temporary constable on the 10th of September 1920 in London and proceeded to Gormston Camp. His service record shows that he was dismissed on the 29th of September 1920. His interview was published in the Nottingham Journal on the 1st of October 1920. He said, "I joined the RIC recently as an ex-serviceman in London in answer to an advertisement, and I was stationed in Gormston during my brief connection with the Black and Tan forces. I passed through Dublin today on my way home to London." He stated 137 Black and Tans tendered their resignations, and 4 of them had sent in their resignation, including himself, were dismissed yesterday. They asked me, said Mr. Flint, the reason for my resignation. I told them that when I joined, I thought I was going into a police force. When they asked me, what did you join? I said straight, it looks like a corps of bandits. Describing the raid in Balbriggan, he said, we were ordered out of our beds and to go to Balbriggan. When we reached the place, we pulled up at the public house, first public house, and the men got to work, firing some shops, smashing windows and doors with their rifle butts. Mr. Flint said they got hold of the liquor and then set fire to the place. What happened afterwards, he said, beyond description, it was worse than anything I'd ever seen or read about. That he added was no work for an Englishman, and that is why I came out of it. Englishmen are misled, and I want them to be told the facts. We left Balbriggan and got back to camp about 3 o'clock in the morning. There were many sore hearts amongst us, but there were plenty of bottles full of liquor to cure them or make them worse. This is some of the propaganda stuff that I came across. And you can see Lloyd George painting his Black and Tans. There's not Balbriggan is mentioned in this one, all the various. What is absolutely the main distinction between the regular RIC, it was in no regular RIC-man's interest to have something like that happen. They were living in the community. Why would you draw that on you at the time? And as I keep going back to, in the place, you could not pick a worse situation to kill a policeman. For to see the last enemy that they would have seen would have been in the trenches. This is another one, Lloyd George with. Now this is one of what they say the Prime Minister's David Lloyd George's greatest critics, and I think he puts everything in perspective. He wasn't liked for it at the time, and he goes on to be a founder of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, but he's saying this just after Balbriggan happens, just after Renine ambush, which happens 2 days after Balbriggan. where the 6 RAC men killed. In fact, I was speaking to a nephew of one last night. There's a mass for him in the house where he was born 100 years to the day next Tuesday. But this is what he says. To say that for all practical purposes, the Army in Ireland, the Royal Irish Constabulary and the Auxiliary Police Force, popularly known as the Black and Tans, are one in perhaps a natural mistake, but a very serious mistake. The relation between the Army and the police are well illustrated in what happened in Reneen, County Clare. A party of 6 police, mainly Black and Tans on patrol, in a motor lorry were ambushed, and 6 of their number were killed. Soldiers came in other motor lorries and drove off the Sinn Féiners. That night the Black and Tans invaded 3 villages, looting, burning houses, killing innocent persons and terrorising innocent women and children. The soldiers, under their officers, helped to rescue the women and children and put out the flames. The reports usually say that these barbarities were perpetrated by armed and uniformed men. They are for the Black and Tans because they wear khaki and around, but they are not soldiers, and the Army are not responsible for their discipline, organisation and training. They have but the smallest of experience in police duties. They are under the command of General Tudor, who is not a subordinate to the Commander-in-Chief of the British Army in Ireland, but it is called the Police Advisor to the Viceroy, Saham Agreement. These young men joined at a time when the nerves of the ordinary RAC were highly tried by the long series of murders perpetuated upon their comrades. Introduced into this atmosphere, the Black and Tans soon became a law unto themselves. I believe that their lives depend, they're exacting not an eye for an eye, but 2 eyes for one. But they believe also, not without justification, that reprisals are part of the justification. Now, there was no condemnation of the reprisals by the Viceroy. In fact, he started, calling out troops or inspecting them, both regulars and RAC. There's a series of photographs with Lord French in that shortly after it. And this is one of the first photographs of the auxiliaries in Dublin. As I said, they didn't arrive in Beggar's Bush until September. And this is the type of uniform he's wearing at the time, completely distinct from a Black and Tan. And this is the type of footage you've probably seen. It's used in the Michael Collins film and The Wind That Shakes the Barley. There's also, what goes with this is the type of propaganda that they used at the time was Lloyd George inspecting the RAs, or the Black and Tans, and the auxiliaries in the quadrangle in London. In fact, it gives the appearance that he's inspecting them before they're going to sort out the Sinn Féiners in Ireland at the time. In fact, what really happened is in reverse. The auxiliaries and the Tans were back in London at 2 funerals, and they took a photo op to do it. So you never really believe what you see in the film. I was involved in making the Michael Collins film, The Wind That Shakes the Barley, and that's the reason that they used the similar thing. This is, I mentioned, Douglas Valderduff, an amazing character. You can get his books on Amazon. He's extraordinary. He's written 104 books, and he was a spy in World War II. He went away to be a monk at one stage. He ends up in Gormiston and ends up in Galway. This is just another connection with the RAC. David Tyne O'Mahony, you can see Dave Allen. His father was an auxiliary, and that's him there on the left-hand side. He was also manager of the Irish Times, and I can see where he gets his sense of humour from. His father was the first baby of the last millennium, and he couldn't have been in World War I, but he was telling everybody he lost his leg in the war. But what actually happened was a printing press fell in his leg and he got gangrene. He had to get his leg off. And where the funny side of it comes in, he went dressed as a toffee apple to a fancy dress party. So this is William Hill, the bookmaker, a Black and Tan. This is where he made his money. He was wounded down in Cork. There was a system in the RIC at the time. He got £3,700 compensation. I gave a talk one night and I mentioned him, and there was a guy down the back of the hall, and he said, "That fella cost me a fortune." And I thought the guy had a gambling problem, but it wasn't. He said, "I tell you what happened." He said, in 1941 during the war years. He had been looked after so well when he was in Mallow that when he came back in 1941, and he left a parcel of money outside the door and came in that night and had a pint with the people who looked after him. And I said, "What's your problem?" And he says, "Well, what happened?" He says, "My aunt," he said, "left that money to the nuns," he says, like that. He lost out on account of William Herlihy and never forget him since. And that's just an account of it there, just about him. I think that's as much as I can relay at this stage. That's it. Yeah.